Welcome again to Imoto on TV. We've got Mr. Motorman, Mr. Ghana Msibi with us today. We're going to be unpacking the budget speech, 2019-2020 budget speech, in terms of how consumers need to look at it and in terms of how Wesbank needs to look at it. Mr. Ghana Msibi, welcome again on another take of Imoto on TV.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful.
Last week, the new finance minister delivered the budget speech. There's a lot of waves after that, a lot of impact, people, opinions. Yeah. Without putting you on the spot, what's your general take on the budget speech that was delivered?
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying, firstly, I did not envy him then. I don't envy him now. But I must say, though, I think the minister really had a tough job to do going into this budget. I must say, from my own assessment, I think he walked a very tight rope, but I think he came out with a very balanced budget under the circumstances. Of course, when I say balanced, doesn't mean it caters for everybody. I think it definitely is a tough budget. There is definitely an impact on consumers across board. But I think if you look at what he had to work with, in the context of what we need to achieve as a country, for where we are, for the kind of GDP growth we require, I think he walked a very tight rope. So I think all in all, I'm very comfortable with what he had produced, and I applaud him. I mean, he was in a very tough position. It was never one of those budgets where you're gonna make everybody happy. But I think he's come out really quite balanced in it.
Speaking of the budget, we expected the roads accident fund, the increase in the levy. We expected some fuel price increases, but now there was a new tax which we spoke about, carbon tax. If you can just tell us what it is and how do you see it impacting, obviously, on the motoring industry?
So I think, firstly, we must understand that there is already a CO2 emissions tax levied on new vehicles. That's already into the system. So when you buy a car, it's already there. And then secondly, I think we've also got to understand that the intention, as explained by the ministry, is that this tax is obviously intended to be invested back into managing emissions. Now, emissions are a massive problem globally, in South Africa included, and so the automotive industry is also quite notorious, for emitting, these emissions, and so there is definitely a lot of talk around the automotive circles about how do you now move into a more electric kind of world? How do you get into hybrid kind of vehicle, or vehicles rather? And we're seeing a lot of different forms coming in, full electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, etc., PHEVs and all those good and wonderful things. And all this is really all in an attempt to minimize the emissions into the ozone layer. So I think the tax is of course, as per the intention, is meant to contribute back into the coffers. I'm not sure how they reconcile it and to put it in. I suppose the Treasury is best positioned to answer on that, but it's definitely going to add massive pressures, of course, on every liter of petrol. And I think it's going to discourage, largely, and I think that's probably the intention, it's going to discourage largely for people to use vehicles by themselves, and I think it tries to move individuals more into a shared services. If I'm going to travel to a direction, Nosibonelo is going the same direction, can you not use it together? Can you not use public transport to try and minimize the congestion as well on the roads?
How do you see this impacting on a company like Wesbank? If you're looking at people that are going to be buying cars, people that are going to own cars, are we going to see more people spending more time with their current car before they change? And obviously you mentioned a good one in terms of hybrid, in terms of electric vehicles. Is Wesbank in that circle in terms of your finance products?
Yeah, so I think the impact is going to definitely cut across Wesbank. It's going to cut across the industry. And the reality of the matter is going to cut across every little thing that we do, because petrol affects transportation. Transportation brings everything. It affects food. It affects, logistics, etc. And so the impact is definitely going to be widespread, and we will definitely feel it from a Wesbank perspective. Importantly, though, is that it is going to affect the overall affordability of customers, because you see, in this 29 cents adjustment, you must understand that goes into the liters of petrol, and so therefore you're going to pay 29 cents more for a full tank, for a liter of petrol than what you were paying before. And so that is effectively going to increase the price of a basic full tank. But now remember, as I've said, transportation. So the trucking companies that transport your basic necessities, foodstuffs, etc., have to now increase their overall transportation costs, and so therefore they're going to pass that on to the consumer. And so before you now know it, the impact is so rippled that it's not just on the total cost of ownership only, but it's about across the entire spectrum of the basket that the consumer spends on. So definitely we're expecting a impact. We are expecting to see people hold their cars for longer, as you've alluded to earlier. From our data, we've already seen that. We've seen that the duration has pushed out. And again, this suggests that consumers are already under pressure. And so people opt to keep their cars for longer, so which ultimately affects consumer spending. Our expectation is that this will exacerbate that, as it were. You speak about electric or the participation of Wesbank in this electrified world. Yes, definitely. We are participating in the financing of electrified vehicles. We're actually, as a matter of fact, are looking forward to a launch very soon with one of our manufacturers who's bringing in a full electric vehicle that we're obviously going to have as part of our package solutions. Of course, it comes with chargers, and it's a different complexity. It's not the same as financing a full combustion engine car. So we are all learning in this. It's different dynamics, different way of looking at the risk, but definitely an exciting space. It's a new era of from horses to ox wagons to cars, and now to electric vehicles. Hey, it keeps moving on.
Now, speaking of that, how would you advise consumers on the side, obviously from Wesbank, how would you advise consumers, I would say Mzansi generally, on how they need to prepare themselves for obviously the increases that we spoke about and the new carbon tax?
It's a very, very important question, because you see, we have seen largely that when consumers make the decision to purchase a vehicle, they look at, can I afford the installment? And you are lucky, then they say, can I afford insurance? And we continue to advocate for consumers to have a total cost of ownership consideration. So can I afford everything else that comes with owning a car? You need to buy tires at some stage. You need petrol, as I've said, insurance, etc. And so our advice to customers is that before making the decision to buy a car, considering the changes in the fuel levy, also factor in the fact that we saw the volatility of Brent crude last year against the rand, so petrol can go up. So this is not the only increase you can expect. There's also increases in interest rates, where we are saying those moves that could also happen. So we suggest and recommend, for the matter of fact, that consumers have a buffer, have a kitty, iskotokoto, where you say, you know what, I can afford to pay 100 rand, but I'm not going to buy a car that costs me 100 rand. I'm going to buy a car that costs me, call it 75 rand. And this 25 rand is for rainy days, because when things then move, then you know that you are very much protected from such volatilities. So we say to the consumers, when you take your decisions, be very measured, be very, very aware that there's a lot in the horizon, a lot of uncertainty. Be on the safe side.
I think, as you heard, on the side of the consumers in South Africa, we really need to be mindful of financing and also to look at affordability. I know Wesbank, in your website, you've punted the affordability calculator, where you're saying people go to the affordability calculator before you get to the part where you're looking for a car. Calculate it and then look at it.
100%. And that was also very deliberate, you know, Swanela, because I can tell you that there's a car that I love. The reality is I can't really afford it. And if I have to take the decision based on how I feel, I'm soon going to be in big trouble. And so our stance is to say, look, we all love certain things in life, and yes, you'll build up to it. But for now, you know, what is the responsible thing to do? Use the calculator, understand what you truly can afford, have a buffer included in that as well. And yeah, you know, buy a vehicle that you know for a fact you'll be able to keep, and you're not going to find yourself in any difficulties going forward.
Just in closing, I'm just thinking of three things: retrenchment cover, deposit protector, and you're looking at shortfall cover. Are those products that consumers really need to consider when they're buying a vehicle, considering that the economy is volatile, anything can happen, you might lose your job, you might, you know, if an accident happens, you're losing so much of your asset.
So again, you know, it's each customer's got different circumstances, but I think in the main, you know, through your finance and insurance advisor at the point where you are purchasing your vehicle, I think you need to be true to your own circumstances and consider those products, because, you know, we never think it's going to happen to me. It can never happen to me. You know, I will never be retrenched, etc. But just be honest to say where the economy is. If I were to get retrenched, could I afford paying this installment? If this car had to get into an accident, could I afford fixing it? And so, you know, my advice is for consumers to take a very prudent approach, and to be very deliberate in terms of managing against possible risks. Ask your FNIs or your finance and insurance consultants at point of sale as to saying, if these are my circumstances, what would the most suitable product be, such that in the event that anything happened, I would be protected.
You heard it right here on the Motor and TV. You need to look after your pocket. You need to make sure that the economy doesn't hit you hard. And again, tune in every time. We're going to be giving you financial literacy, and we're going to be giving you more information for what products, what Wesbank has in store, to make sure that the impact of the economy is lessened on you as well. But like I said, be here with Wesbank and the Motor on TV, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, Mr. Msibi.
Thank you as well.